This story is called Curious George Gets a Medal by H.A. Ray. What's that? That's like an old vacuum. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. George was alone this morning looking at a picture book when the doorbell rang. Ding dong. It was the mailman. "Here's a letter for you," he said. "Put it on your friend's desk. He'll read it to you when he comes home." George was curious. It was not often that somebody wrote to him. Too bad he could not read the letter. But maybe he could write one himself. In the top drawer of the desk, there was paper and ink and a fountain pen. George sat down on the floor and began to write, but the pen was dry. It's an old-fashioned kind of pen that you had to fill up. It needed ink. George would have to fill it. He got the funnel from the kitchen and started pouring ink. But instead of going into the pen, the ink spilled all over and made a big blue puddle on the floor. It was an awful mess. Quickly, George got the blotter from the desk, but that was no help. The puddle grew bigger all the time. George had to think of something else. Why, soap and water. That's what you clean up with. From the kitchen shelf, he got a big box of soap powder and poured all the powder all over the ink. I wonder if that's going to work. Then he pulled the garden hose in through the window and opened the tap and sprayed water all over the powder. Bubbles began to form, and then some lather. Bloop, 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 bloop. And more lather, and more lather, and more lather. Oh my goodness, what's George gonna do? In no time at all, the whole room was full of lather. So full, indeed, that George had to escape in a hurry. Where is he? Look, there he goes, out the window. When he was safely out of the house, he first turned off the tap. But what next? How could he get rid of all that lather before his friend came home? George sat down in the grass and thought for a long time. Finally, he had an idea. He would get the big shovel and shovel the lather out the window. That might work. But where was the lather? All the bubbles are gone. While George had been outside thinking, it had all turned to water. Now the room looked like a lake, and the furniture was like islands in it. The shovel would be no use. A pump was what George needed. So he knew just where to get a portable pump. He had seen one at the farm down the road. There he goes, running down the road to the farm. The farmer was away working in the fields, and nobody noticed when George got the pump out of the shed. It was very heavy. He would need to pull it all the way back to the house. That's pretty hard for a little monkey to do. Oh, look at the chicken. Maybe he could tie the goat to the pump and make her pull it. But just as George was about to slip a loop of rope over the goat's head, he was hurled through the air. Oh, look, that billy goat bumped him. And he landed near a pen full of pigs. Oh no, George, don't make a bad choice. The biggest pig was standing near the gate. What if George opened the gate just a little to let him out? A big pig could easily pull a small pump. Carefully, George lifted the latch. And before he knew it, all of the pigs had burst out squealing and grunting and trying to get away as fast as they could. George was delighted. He had never seen anything like that before. For the moment, all his troubles were forgotten. But now, all the pigs were gone, and there was not a single one left to help him with the pump. What's he going to do next? Luckily, there were cows grazing nearby in a field. Cows are gentle and strong, and it would mean nothing for a cow to pull a pump for him. I wonder if that will work. This time, George was right. The cow did not mind being tied to the pump. She even let him climb on her back, and off they went. George was glad. Now he would soon be home, pump out the room, and everything would be all right. He looks pretty happy. My cow looks pretty happy too. And there's that old-fashioned pump. Meanwhile, the farmer and his son had heard the squealing of the pigs, and they had rushed from the fields and had their hands full trying to catch all of the pigs. Not until the last pig was safely in the pen did they have time to look around. And what did they see? A little monkey riding away on their cow with their pump. The chase was on. George and the cow were ahead at first, but the pump was slowing them down, and the farmers were getting closer and closer. Now they were almost caught up with them, but where was George? Do you see where he might be? Whose hands are that on that clothesline? Here he was, hiding in a shirt. The farmers ran right past him, but on their way home, they had to come back over the same road. George did not feel safe in his hiding place. Just then a truck came rattling down the road. George jumped aboard. Monkeys are very good at jumping, and was gone before the farmers had a chance to see him. Here they are coming back with the cow and the pump. And that truck driver doesn't even know. I wonder where they're going. That says Museum of Science. The truck drove to a part of town that George had never seen before. At last it stopped in front of a large building. It was a museum. George did not know what a museum was. He was curious. While the guard was busy reading his paper, George slipped inside. There he goes, inside the museum. He walked up the steps and into a room full of all sorts of animals. At first, George was scared. But then he noticed that they did not move. They were not alive. They were stuffed animals put into the museum so that everyone could get a good look at them. Ooh, what's that? In the next room, George saw something so enormous it took his breath away. Look how big that is. It was a dinosaur. George was not scared this time. He knew it was not real. He looked at the dinosaur, and then at the baby dinosaur, and then he saw the palm tree full of nuts, coconuts. George liked nuts, and suddenly he felt very hungry. He had missed lunch that day. He would climb up, but Just then he heard footsteps. He had to hide again, but where? What's he going to do now? A family came in to take a look at the dinosaur. They paid no attention to the little monkey who was standing there. The monkey did not move. He stood so still, they thought he was just another stuffed animal. George was glad when they were gone. Now he could pick the nuts. He climbed up the dinosaur's neck and started to pull, but the nuts would not come off. George did not know that they weren't real either. He pulled harder and harder, and the tree began to sway. Crash! Down came the tree, and the dinosaur's head, and the dinosaur, and down came George. Guards came rushing in from all sides, and underneath the fallen dinosaur, they found a little monkey. They pulled him out of there, and they brought him to Professor Wiseman, who was the director of the museum. Professor Wiseman was terribly angry. "Lock that naughty monkey up right away," he said, "and take him back to the zoo. He must have run away from there." Oh no, George doesn't live in a zoo. What's going to happen now? George was carried off in a cage. Oh, poor George. He felt so ashamed. He almost wished he hadn't been. Suddenly the door opened. "George!" somebody shouted. It was his friend, the man with the yellow hat. "It seems you've gotten yourself into a lot of trouble today," he said, "but maybe this letter here will get you out of it. It's from Professor Wiseman. He needs your help with an experiment. I found it on my desk at home, but I couldn't find you anywhere, so I came over here to talk to the professor." And this is what the letter said. "Dear George, a small spaceship has been built for our experimental station. It is too small for a man, but it could carry a little monkey. Would you be willing to go up in it? I've never met you, but I hear you are a bright little monkey that can do all sorts of things, and that is just what we need. We want you to do something nobody has ever done before. Bail out of a spaceship in flight. When we flash you a signal, you will have to open the door and bail out with the help of emergency rockets. We hope you're willing and that your friend will permit you to go. Gratefully yours, Professor Wiseman, Director of the Science Museum." "So, you are George," said Professor Wiseman. "If only I'd known. Of course, everything will be forgiven. Are you willing to go?" They got the smallest size spacesuit for George and all the other things that they would need. And they helped him put them on and showed him how to use them. And when everything was ready, there's George in his spacesuit. When everything was ready, a truck drove up with a special television with a screen mounted on it to watch the flight. And they all got on and were off to the launching site. They checked all the controls of the spaceship, especially the lever that opened the door. And George tried it too. Here's the rocket ship. The great moment had come. George waved goodbye and went aboard. The door was closed. Professor Wiseman began to count. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! And he pressed the button, and the ship rose up into the air, slowly at first, and then faster and faster and higher, until they could no longer see it in the sky. But on the screen, they saw George clearly the whole time. Now the moment had come for George to bail out. Professor Wiseman flashed the signal. They watched the screen. George did not move. Why didn't he pull the lever? In a few seconds it would be too late. The spaceship would be lost in outer space with George in it. They waited anxiously. At last, George began to move. Slowly, as if in a daze, he groped for the lever. Would he reach it in time? There, he grabbed it. The door opened. Hurrah! George was on his way. Oh, there he is in his parachute. Out of the blue, an open parachute came floating down to earth, and the truck raced over to the spot where George would land. What a welcome for George! Professor Wiseman hung a big gold medal around his neck because, he said, you are the first living being to come back to Earth from spaceflight. And the medal said, to George, the first space monkey. And then a newspaper man took his picture, and everybody shouted and cheered, even the farmer and his son, and the kind woman from next door who'd worked hours to get the water out of the room. I'm so proud of you, George, said the man with the yellow hat. I guess the whole world is proud of you today. It was the happiest day in George's life. The end. There he is with his medal.